Dust choked the California sky as heavy yellow bulldozers ripped through 60 years of family legacy, crushing priceless vines into the dirt. Harrison Caldwell smiled, thinking he'd just legally stolen a young woman's farm for pennies. He didn't realize that single destroyed harvest would soon cost his empire millions. The morning the machines arrived, the air in the San Joaquin Valley was thick with the sweet, earthy scent of late summer. Abigail Preston, 23 years old and still grieving, was standing at the kitchen sink of her late grandfather's farmhouse when the low, guttural rumble of diesel engines rattled the window panes. Abigail had inherited Sunridge vines just 3 months prior, following the sudden passing of her grandfather, Elias Preston. Elias had been a master viticulturist, a man whose hands were permanently stained with the dark purple tannin of the earth he loved. He had spent his entire life cultivating 40 acres of prime, sun-drenched valley soil, specializing in a highly specific yield of Cabernet Sauvignon that local winemakers quietly fought over every harvest season. But Sunridge vines possessed something far more valuable than good soil to men who didn't care about grapes: location. The farm sat dead center in the proposed footprint of the Crest, a sprawling billion-dollar luxury subdivision spearheaded by Caldwell Finch Enterprises. Harrison Caldwell was a developer whose reputation preceded him. He was a man who viewed the valley not as agricultural gold, but as a blank canvas for gated communities, golf courses, and artificial lakes. For 2 years, Caldwell had aggressively bought up the surrounding farmland, bullying aging farmers into early retirements with lowball cash offers and subtle threats of endless litigation. Elias Preston had been the only holdout. When Elias died, Caldwell assumed the stubbornness died with him. He expected the grieving, overwhelmed granddaughter to take his first offer of $1.2 million, a fraction of the land's true worth, and disappear. Abigail did not disappear. She rejected the offer, formally and legally, through a brief letter. She intended to harvest her grandfather's final crop, a spectacular yield that was only weeks away from being picked. As the farmhouse walls began to vibrate, Abigail dropped her coffee mug. It shattered against the linoleum, but she didn't stop to look. She sprinted out the back door, her boots pounding against the dry dirt, her heart hammering in her throat. What she saw at the crest of the hill made her blood run cold. 3 massive Caterpillar D9 bulldozers were lined up at the eastern boundary of the property, their massive steel blades already lowered into the soil. Behind them sat a convoy of excavators and dump trucks, and standing by the property line, flanked by 2 private security guards and a local county sheriff's deputy, was Harrison Caldwell. He wore a crisp, tailored suit that looked absurd against the backdrop of the dusty valley, his silver hair unmoving in the morning breeze. Beside him stood his lead counsel, Mitchell Gable, holding a leather briefcase. "Stop!" Abigail screamed, tearing down the vineyard rows. The vines whipped against her jeans, heavy with tight, dark clusters of ripening grapes. "Shut them down. You have no right to be here." Caldwell didn't even flinch. He merely nodded to the foreman, who signaled the operators. The first bulldozer surged forward. With a sickening, woody crunch, the steel blades snapped the ancient wooden trellises, ripping a 50-yard row of 60-year-old vines out by their deep, gnarled roots. The plants, heavy with Elias Preston's life's work, were violently folded into the dirt like trash. Abigail threw herself in front of the second machine's path, forcing the operator to slam on the brakes. Dust billowed around her in a suffocating cloud. "Deputy," Caldwell barked, his voice sharp and devoid of emotion, "remove her from the construction zone. She is trespassing on county-approved development land." The sheriff's deputy, a man who looked distinctly uncomfortable, jogged over and caught Abigail by the arm. "Miss Preston, you need to step back." "This is my land," Abigail sobbed, fighting against the deputy's grip, her eyes wide with horror as another row of vines was casually annihilated to her left. "My grandfather's name is on the deed. They are destroying my harvest." Mitchell Gable stepped forward, pulling a thick stack of papers from his briefcase. He held them out with a condescending smile. Actually, Miss Preston, your grandfather's deed was subject to a 1944 municipal utility and access easement, which Caldwell Finch Enterprises purchased from the county 3 days ago. By enacting our right-of-way, we are legally entitled to clear this corridor. We posted the 24-hour notice on the front gate yesterday. There was no notice, Abigail cried out. The wind must have blown it away, Caldwell said dryly, checking his heavy gold wristwatch. It's a shame about the plants, truly. But progress doesn't wait for the harvest, Abigail. You should have taken the check. Abigail watched in absolute paralyzed devastation as the legal sleight of hand played out in front of her. The easement was an antiquated technicality, a forgotten line on a map drawn during World War II that allowed the county to build an access road that was never constructed. Caldwell hadn't bought her land. He had bribed and lobbied the county into selling him the dormant right-of-way, weaponizing it to drive a literal road through the absolute center of her most valuable vines, effectively splitting the farm in two and rendering the irrigation system useless. For the next 4 hours, Abigail was forced to sit on the porch of the farmhouse, restrained by the threat of arrest, as the machines systematically destroyed 35 acres of prime Cabernet. The air grew thick with the sharp, acidic smell of crushed green wood and thousands of pounds of ruptured, bleeding grapes. It was a massacre. The soil was turned inside out. The delicate root systems that had taken half a century to establish were shredded into kindling. When the engines finally cut out in the late afternoon, the eastern slope of Sunridge vines was gone. In its place was a horrific, barren scar of churned, muddy earth. Caldwell and his men packed up their trucks and drove away, leaving a young woman alone in the devastating silence of her ruined inheritance. They believed they had broken her spirit. They believed the land was now worthless, and she would beg them to buy the scraps. They were catastrophically wrong. The sun dipped below the California hills, casting long, bruised purple shadows over the destroyed vineyard. Abigail walked through the fresh dirt, her boots sinking into the soft, pulverized earth. Every few steps, she bent down to pick up a severed branch, the grapes already shriveling as they bled their juice into the dust. The financial loss was staggering. The upcoming harvest alone was contracted for hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the emotional toll was a heavy, suffocating weight. This was her grandfather's soul, bulldozed into mulch. The next morning, the local agricultural community was buzzing with quiet outrage, but no one dared speak against Harrison Caldwell. He owned the local politicians, the zoning board, and most of the judges. Abigail sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at Mitchell Gable's easement documents. She had called 4 different law firms in the county. 3 refused to take her calls as soon as they heard Caldwell's name. The 4th told her she was out of luck. The easement, however dirty, was technically legal. Just before noon, a battered, rust-spotted Ford pickup truck rattled up the gravel driveway. A man stepped out. He looked to be in his late 40s, wearing a faded denim shirt and carrying a leather satchel that had seen better days. His name was Daniel Roth. Daniel was not a slick corporate attorney. 10 years ago, he had been one of the most ruthless environmental and agricultural litigators in the state, right up until a massive corporate retaliation campaign had cost him his marriage, his big city practice, and very nearly his license. He had retreated to the valley to practice small-town law, quietly nursing a deep, burning hatred for corporate developers. "I heard what happened," Daniel said, not waiting for an invitation as he walked up the porch steps. He looked out over the scar of dirt dividing the property. His jaw tightened. Caldwell used the old eminent domain proxy trick. Section 4A of the county code. I've seen him do it twice before. Abigail looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "Every lawyer in town says it's legal. They say I have to let it go." "Every lawyer in town plays golf at Caldwell's Country Club," Daniel replied, pulling out a chair and sitting heavily. He dropped his satchel on the table. "I don't play golf. Miss Preston, I want to see the damage, not the dirt. I want to see the actual plants he destroyed." Abigail led Daniel out into the wreckage. Daniel didn't just look at the destruction. He knelt in the dirt, examining the shredded rootstock. He picked up a crushed cluster of grapes and rubbed the skin between his fingers, smelling the dark juice. Then he asked a question that would change the entire trajectory of Abigail's life. "Your grandfather, Elias, he didn't buy commercial nursery stock, did he?" Daniel asked, his eyes narrowing as he inspected a fractured piece of the lower vine trunk. "No," Abigail said, wiping her forehead. "Grandpa was a grafter, a fanatic about it. He crossbred everything himself. The main block that they destroyed, he has spent 30 years developing that specific strain. He called it the ironclad because it was the only vine in the valley that completely resisted Pierce's disease." Daniel froze. The piece of wood slipped from his fingers. He stood up slowly. "Wait, are you telling me your grandfather engineered a Pierce's disease-resistant Cabernet clone? And it was growing right here?" "Yes," Abigail said, confused by his sudden intensity. "The bugs would bite the leaves, but the bacteria never spread. UC Davis even sent a researcher out a few years ago to take samples, but Grandpa kicked him off the property. He was paranoid about corporate agriculture, stealing his life's work. He kept all his grafting journals locked in the basement." A slow, dangerous smile spread across Daniel Roth's face. It was the smile of a wolf that had just found the sheep's throat. "Abigail," Daniel said, his voice dropping to an intense whisper. "Muscle, Caldwell thinks he just destroyed standard agricultural property. He thinks his liability, if you somehow manage to sue him, is capped at the market value of a regular grape harvest and some damaged dirt, maybe a few $100,000. Daniel grabbed her by the shoulders. He didn't destroy standard property. He destroyed undocumented proprietary, intellectual agricultural assets. If what you're saying is true, your grandfather's ironclad strain could have revolutionized the global wine industry. It was worth millions, tens of millions." The realization hit Abigail like a physical blow. The tragedy of the bulldozers suddenly shifted from a story of victimization to a story of profound, catastrophic corporate liability. "We need the journals," Daniel said, already walking briskly back toward the farmhouse. "And we need an expert to verify the genetics of whatever rootstock is left in the ground before it rots. We have to prove what he killed." For the next 48 hours, the farmhouse turned into a war room. Abigail broke the padlock off her grandfather's old basement filing cabinets. Inside, they found exactly what they needed: decades of meticulous, handwritten ledgers detailing the genetic crossbreeding of the ironclad strain. Elias had logged every success, every failure, and most importantly, the exact chemical and biological resistance of the final crop. Daniel made a quiet phone call to Dr. Leonard Hayes, a prominent viticulture geneticist at UC Davis who harbored a deep respect for rogue farmers like Elias. Under the cover of darkness, to avoid Caldwell's security patrols, Dr. Hayes arrived at Sunridge Vines. Wearing a headlamp, the scientist carefully extracted surviving root tissue from the crushed perimeter of the bulldozer tracks. 3 days later, the lab results confirmed it. The DNA was unique. The resistance was real. The ironclad was a genuine agricultural marvel. While Caldwell Finch Enterprises arrogantly began pouring the first concrete foundations on the far side of the easement, completely ignoring Abigail, Daniel Roth was quietly drafting a lawsuit that would shake the California real estate industry to its core. They weren't suing for property damage. They were suing for the willful, negligent destruction of a priceless biological patent. When Mitchell Gable received the manila envelope containing the lawsuit 2 weeks later, he initially laughed, assuming it was a desperate plea for a settlement. But as his eyes scanned the allegations, the damages demanded, and the attached genetic affidavits from UC Davis, the color completely drained from the lawyer's face. The trap had been set. The war for Sunridge had just begun. The heavy mahogany doors of Caldwell Finch Enterprises boardroom slammed shut, rattling the framed blueprints of luxury subdivisions that lined the walls. Harrison Caldwell stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the valley, his hands shoved deep into his tailored trousers. For the first time in his career, the view did not fill him with a sense of conquering pride. On the massive glass conference table behind him lay the lawsuit Daniel Roth had filed. It demanded $42 million in compensatory damages for the destruction of proprietary genetic property, plus punitive damages for malicious trespass. Mitchell Gable, normally composed and impeccably arrogant, was sweating through his expensive silk tie. He aggressively flipped through the exhibits attached to the complaint. "This is absurd," Gable muttered, tapping a manicured finger against the DNA sequencing reports provided by Dr. Leonard Hayes. "It's a bluff, Harrison. They're trying to turn a trespassing dispute over a few tons of crushed fruit into an intellectual property war. They want us to settle so they can walk away with a couple of million. We bury them in paperwork. We stretch this out for 5 years until the girl goes bankrupt and sells the farm for scrap." Caldwell turned around, his eyes cold and calculating. "Do not underestimate a cornered animal, Mitchell, especially one represented by Daniel Roth. I know his history. He used to tear apart oil companies in the 90s before he got sent to the minor leagues. He doesn't bluff. If he says he has a genetically unique, a disease-resistant vine, he has it. But we cannot let this go to a jury. If a local jury sees a crying orphan farmer and a wealthy developer, they will empty our bank accounts just on principle." The strategy was set. If they couldn't beat the genetics, they had to break the girl. Over the next 6 months, the legal assault on Abigail Preston was relentless and suffocating. Caldwell's legal team filed dozens of motion-to-dismiss requests, endless discovery demands, and frivolous countersuits claiming Abigail had intentionally interfered with a county-approved infrastructure project. They demanded decades of tax returns, Elias Preston's medical records, and every scrap of paper the family had ever generated. It was a classic corporate siege tactic: bleed the plaintiff dry through legal fees until they capitulate. But Daniel Roth was working on contingency, and he was fueled by a decade of suppressed rage against men exactly like Caldwell. He matched Gable blow for blow, shielding Abigail from the worst of the legal shrapnel. The breaking point nearly came during the depositions. On a sweltering Tuesday in October, Abigail found herself sitting in a sterile, windowless conference room in downtown Fresno. A court reporter tapped away silently in the corner. Across the table, Mitchell Gable leaned forward, a shark smelling blood in the water. Caldwell sat quietly in the corner, his eyes fixed on Abigail, trying to intimidate her through sheer presence. Gable spent 4 grueling hours trying to paint Elias Preston as a senile, paranoid hoarder who couldn't possibly have engineered a stable agricultural clone. "Miss Preston," Gable said, his voice dripping with condescension, "isn't it true that your grandfather was entirely self-taught? That he possessed no formal degree in botany, genetics, or agronomy from any accredited university? He didn't need a degree to know his soil," Abigail fired back, her hands trembling under the table, but her voice remarkably steady. "He spent 50 years crossbreeding those plants. The journals prove it." "Ah, yes, the journals," Gable chuckled, tossing a copy of Elias's handwritten notes onto the table. "Ramblings in a basement. Miss Preston, are you aware that without a registered patent prior to the destruction, the alleged intellectual property is legally considered standard vegetation? You're trying to put a multi-million-dollar price tag on weeds." "Objection," badgering the witness and blatantly misstating intellectual property law, Daniel snapped, not even looking up from his notes. "Save the theatrics for the judge, Mitchell. You know as well as I do that common law trade secrets and unregistered proprietary genetics are protected under the California Uniform Trade Secrets Act." Gable sneered, but he moved on. However, Caldwell wasn't just relying on legal intimidation. When the deposition failed to break Abigail, he attacked her finances. 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, Abigail received a certified letter from a massive regional bank. The bank held the mortgage on her grandfather's tractors, harvesting equipment, and the farmhouse itself. Caldwell had quietly leveraged his massive corporate accounts at the same bank to pressure the loan officers into calling in the debts early, citing a vague, high-risk clause triggered by the destruction of the property's main income source, the very harvest Caldwell had destroyed. They demanded $200,000 within 30 days, or they would foreclose on the farmhouse. Abigail sat on her porch, staring at the foreclosure notice as the sun set over the ruined field. The heavy yellow machines of Caldwell Finch Enterprises were still parked just across the property line, waiting to finish the job once she was evicted. She felt a crushing wave of despair. She was a 23-year-old girl fighting a billion-dollar empire. She was out of money, out of energy, and out of time. She called Daniel, her voice hollow. "They got the bank to call the loans, Daniel. I have 30 days. I have to drop the suit. If I settle now, Caldwell will pay off the bank and give me enough to start over somewhere else. If I don't, I lose the house. I lose everything Grandpa built." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Daniel Roth spoke, his voice vibrating with a quiet, dangerous intensity. "Don't sign a damn thing. Caldwell just made a fatal mistake. He didn't just bully a farmer, he committed tortious interference with a financial institution to obstruct justice. Give me 48 hours. Daniel didn't sleep for 2 days. He cashed in every favor he had left in San Francisco. He drove to the glittering high-rises of the financial district and walked into the offices of a massive litigation finance firm. He slammed Dr. Leonard Hayes's genetic reports and the bank's foreclosure notice on the desk of a senior partner. He didn't ask for a loan, he sold them a percentage of the final verdict. When Daniel returned to Sunridge Vines, he handed Abigail a cashier's check for $300,000. "Pay the bank," Daniel said, a fierce fire burning in his eyes. "Tell them to go to hell. We are taking Harrison Caldwell to court, and we are going to burn his empire to the ground." The trial of Preston versus Caldwell Finch Enterprises began in the heat of early summer, nearly a year after the bulldozers had torn through Sunridge. The county courthouse was packed. Local farmers, journalists, and corporate representatives filled the wooden pews, the air thick with anticipation. Honorable Judge William Thatcher, a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for despising courtroom theatrics, presided over the case. Mitchell Gable opened the defense with his usual polished arrogance. He painted Caldwell as a visionary developer bringing jobs and infrastructure to a dying agricultural sector. He characterized the destruction of the vines as a regrettable but legally justified mistake, a minor casualty of progress backed by a legitimate county easement. He insisted the damages should be capped at the market value of standard grapes, a mere $200,000. Daniel Roth didn't give an opening statement about property lines or easements. He placed a single, shriveled piece of destroyed rootstock on the jury rail. "This is not a case about dirt," Daniel told the jury, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "This is a case about theft, the theft of a lifetime of genius, stolen by a man who believed his money made him immune to the law." The trial hinged entirely on the value of the ironclad strain. Dr. Leonard Hayes took the stand as the plaintiff's star witness. Under Daniel's careful questioning, the brilliant geneticist explained the catastrophic threat of Pierce's disease to the global wine industry, a bacteria that cost California vineyards tens of millions of dollars annually. "Dr. Hayes," Daniel asked, pacing slowly before the jury box, "based on your DNA sequencing of the destroyed Sunridge rootstock and your analysis of Elias Preston's grafting journals, what was the significance of these plants?" "They were a biological miracle," Dr. Hayes stated firmly, adjusting his glasses. Elias Preston had successfully bred a hyper-specific Cabernet clone that was completely immune to the bacteria. It maintained the yield and flavor profile of a premium grape while acting essentially as a fortress against disease. I have colleagues at major universities who have spent 20 years and millions in grant money trying to achieve what Mr. Preston achieved in his basement. And if Mr. Preston had patented and licensed this rootstock to commercial nurseries, what would the market value of that intellectual property be? Conservatively, Dr. Hayes paused, letting the silence hang. Given the global demand for resistant stock, $40 to $50 million. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Mitchell Gable jumped up, shouting objections about speculative damages. But Judge Thatcher overruled him. The financial stakes had just been irrevocably established. But the true climax of the trial did not come from the genetics. It came from a devastating twist that Daniel had kept hidden until the final day of testimony. Harrison Caldwell was on the stand, radiating smug confidence. He denied knowing anything about the vine's unique properties, claiming he only saw a blighted old farm standing in the way of a luxury golf course. He testified that the destruction was merely the execution of a standard easement clearance. Daniel approached the podium, holding a single manila folder. He didn't look angry. He looked remarkably calm. "Mr. Caldwell, you claim you had no idea Elias Preston's vines were anything more than standard agricultural property. Is that correct?" "That is correct," Caldwell said smoothly. "I am a real estate developer, Mr. Roth. I don't know the difference between a Cabernet grape and a table grape, nor do I care." "I see," Daniel said. He pulled a piece of paper from the folder and handed it to the bailiff to present to Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell, do you recognize this email?" Caldwell looked at the paper. For the first time in the entire trial, the color completely drained from his face. His jaw went slack. "Let the record show," Daniel announced, his voice ringing like a bell, "that this is a subpoenaed internal communication from Caldwell Finch Enterprises, dated 3 weeks before the bulldozers were sent to Sunridge Vines. It was sent to Mr. Caldwell by a private agricultural consultant named Bradley Walsh." Abigail gasped. She remembered that name. Bradley Walsh was the UC Davis researcher her grandfather had kicked off the property years ago for snooping around the vines. Daniel turned to the jury. "In this email, Mr. Walsh informs Mr. Caldwell that Elias Preston is sitting on a proprietary, disease-resistant clone worth tens of millions of dollars. He warns Mr. Caldwell that if Preston patents the clone, the land value of Sunridge Vines will skyrocket into the stratosphere, making it utterly impossible for Caldwell to afford the property for his subdivision." Daniel stepped right up to the witness stand, locking eyes with the panicked billionaire. "You didn't bulldoze those plants by accident, Harrison. You didn't do it to clear an easement. You rushed those bulldozers in to murder the plants because you knew that destroying the intellectual property was the only way to keep the land cheap. You committed corporate sabotage to protect your profit margins." The courtroom erupted. Judge Thatcher had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. Mitchell Gable sat frozen in his chair, realizing his client had lied to him and that the case was completely, utterly lost. Caldwell stammered, trying to formulate an excuse, but the email was a smoking gun of malicious intent. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When the foreperson stood to read the verdict, Abigail gripped Daniel's hand so hard her knuckles turned white. The jury found Caldwell Finch Enterprises liable for gross negligence, malicious destruction of property, and intellectual property sabotage. They awarded Abigail Preston $12 million in compensatory damages for the loss of the IP, but the jury wasn't done. Enraged by Caldwell's blatant corruption and arrogance, they levied a staggering $46 million in punitive damages. A total verdict of $58 million. Harrison Caldwell slumped in his chair, a broken, ruined man. His company's stock would plummet the next morning. The financial blow, combined with the criminal fraud investigations that would inevitably follow the release of the email, meant Caldwell Finch Enterprises was effectively dead. 3 years later, the heavy yellow machines were gone, sold off at bankruptcy auctions. The luxury subdivision was never built. Instead, Abigail Preston stood on the eastern ridge of her farm, watching the morning sun illuminate row upon row of newly planted, vibrant green vines. With the settlement money, she had hired Dr. Hayes to help her recreate her grandfather's lifework from the surviving tissue samples. The ironclad strain had returned, stronger than ever, its roots driven deep into the invincible soil of Sunridge. Corporate greed thought it could crush a family's legacy under the treads of a bulldozer, but they forgot that some roots run deeper than concrete. Abigail's fight proves that no amount of money or intimidation can silence the truth when you have the courage to stand your ground. If you love this incredible story of justice, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable true stories.